Welcome to the 12th episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. Today we are joined with, and I'm sort of fanboying, I'm very excited about this guest today, Michael Hilliard, the host of the Redline podcast. The Redline podcast talks about, a lot of geopolitical issues, that are a bit more niche than what you might expect to find on the front pages of a BBC or an Al Jazeera. I really encourage all of our listeners to go and check out some of their episodes. There's definitely going to be one that sort of suits your fancy. I'm going to let Michael give a bit of an introduction about himself. But again, an episode comes out every couple weeks. They're really great, and we're excited to talk to him today about both the podcast himself and then some of the hot issues in geopolitics today. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I've been a fan of your guys' work for a while as well. So the Red Line is effectively a geopolitics program that we get on experts from the White House, CIA, Oxford, Harvard, and ambassadors to come in and discuss one big geopolitical issue shaping the news, whether it be the Russian hypersonic missile programs, or it could be the Libyan civil war. Effectively, the idea is rather than going through the usual explain a situation in 2 minutes, we like to go for an hour and a half and really go into the who, what, where, and why of these conflicts, and getting in experts who are actually making the decisions as well. So it's, if you want to hear a really deep political analysis on one big subject that changes each fortnight, that's probably the place to go. You can find us on all the usual podcast places, but very excited to be here today and talk about some of the other issues.
Amazing. So I think we want to get started off. I mean, you gave just a really, helpful overview of what the podcast is about. In what ways was the show and was some of the episodes that you've, talked about on the podcast inspired or driven by your academic sort of background, as well as your professional background?
So my background was as conflict journalism and writing defense papers in Eastern Europe, particularly focusing on Russian defense. So obviously the show has covered quite a lot of the former Soviet Union countries. Sometimes because I'm lazy and I need to do an episode where I don't have to do as much research. So we've covered a lot of the Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. We've also covered a lot of Russia, as well as Ukraine, Moldova, Transnistria. But we do branch out. We do a lot of Asia-Pacific work due to the fact that, I live in Australia. The Asia-Pacific is on everyone's mind at the moment, as well as a bit of South America, the Caribbean. But I also like really niche topics as well. So we just did a piece on the geopolitics of the rare earth trade, as well as doing stuff on private military contractors and how they operate. So there's always stuff to talk about, whether it be Africa or the Middle East. And I like to dive into really niche issues that quite often have a lot bigger impacts than most people would imagine.
And what's the story like behind the podcast? What sort of drove you to start the Redline podcast? What was sort of that experience like? And what was sort of your vision from it, and how has that vision changed now that you're over 40 episodes into the Redline podcast?
So originally I was actually a writer for bands and whatnot. And I'd been writing and being a journalist for a while. And then I went to Russia on a whim with a good friend of mine. And I loved my time in Russia, and I met some, I've always been a fan of defense work and whatnot, and interested in that kind of sphere of things. But then I met with another conflict journalist over there who was at the time reporting out of Ukraine. And, we got along like a house on fire, and I started helping him to write defense papers. And then from there, I obviously did my degree in international relations and economics. And I started writing defense papers and ghostwriting for a lot of people. So ghostwriting is effectively where, someone from, let's say, the British House of Lords will pay you handsomely to go to Moldova and write on Moldova defense, and then pay you to scrub your name off it and pretend it was theirs the whole time, which, it pays incredibly well. And if you're young, it's not a bad way to go. So I'd been sitting in these countries being shot at and writing and, doing all the nonsense stuff. And then a friend of mine said, look, we should do a podcast. You've got this weird Rolodex of guys I met in bars and officials and whatnot, from the White House and Moscow and, London and whatnot. And I went, yeah, let's do it. And then we did, I think, 3 episodes, and then he got a job elsewhere. And at the time, the show was meant to be this very Australia focused program. We were going to be doing lots of like the Australian housing market and a few things like that. But the audience turned out to be, very little Australian. So we kind of pivoted. I wanted to pivot anyway. I was like, look, geopolitics and wider international focus is definitely where I feel more comfortable. So we pivoted, and that's why, effectively once we hit episode 4, it started going to like Yemen, Transnistria, and Iraq and Iran and those kind of countries. And then I think that's where the show, sits today. So it hasn't changed too much from where it started. It's just much less Australia focused, which means that my sleep pattern doesn't exist anymore. But it's much more where I prefer. I think Australia is a small part of a bigger story.
And I'll say just briefly, I think the rare earths episode was one of our favorites because a lot of the elections that we've covered tend to have sort of rare sub themes in terms of, the natural resources that these countries possess. And so we've written about like lithium in Portugal and uranium in Niger. And so we definitely found that episode very interesting. And so that sort of leads into the next question, which is, is there sort of a uniform way that you go about approaching doing research for these episodes? I know you mentioned off air that it sometimes takes 30 hours of research before you even start to talk to these experts. Yeah, from topic generation to research to guest selection, is there sort of a pattern there?
Yeah, of course. So effectively, I have a master whiteboard that sits kind of just off camera here of what topics are coming up. And usually we do topics in a couple of batches. So we'll do a couple of topics at once. So usually it's one kind of time sensitive one. There's usually one really difficult piece. So like rare earths took us 2 months to put together. It was a long piece. And there's usually one that we call a can piece, which is effectively it's a country or a place in the world that won't change very much. So something like Tajikistan, we're pretty certain that we can put that out. Obviously there's actually conflict right now, but you can be pretty confident that you can launch it in 8 weeks and it'll be pretty much the same. Yep. And we usually go through things in batches. Now, when I start research for a piece, quite often I will actually start with YouTube. I'll see what the commentators have been saying, what areas people are focusing on, and what is out there. And then I will go then start talking to contacts I have in defense circles, think tanks, governments, and start asking for white papers or getting access to white papers, and effectively getting that spectrum of, what is the general public, what is YouTube saying, and then what are the defense community saying, and then try and meet somewhere in the middle. Being interesting enough the defense community likes it, and being, exciting enough that the general public might be interested. Then obviously it's just talking to smart people, reading a lot of books. And I cannot tell you the amount of time I will, book a Zoom call with some journalists in the region and have a beer with them over Zoom and just pick their brains on, well, if this is happening to this, why is this? And, talking to smart people is effectively 90% of what I do. And that's what I advise for everyone. Frankly, no one should ever pretend to be the expert on everything. And you guys do it as well. You guys speak to lots and lots of experts. So you know that, going to the source of information is incredibly important.
I'm just, what is there a particular episode where the gap between what the commentators and what the defense officials was saying was like particularly stark in terms of difference?
There's the South Sudan was always interesting. What government and defense said was very, very different. Obviously, rare earths is an interesting piece because what the contractors will tell you and what the government will tell you do different things. Private militaries is probably the one where there's this biggest stark that the army's very against it, but some bits of government are really for it. And it really kind of almost depends on where you sit politically, ideologically, for you to decide how you feel about private militaries. Obviously, there is always going to be difference, and we try and encourage that to have multiple opinions on the Red Line. We're not an echo chamber show. So, it's not unusual that the first guest and the second guest will generally agree on the basics, but they might have different ideologies on how problems can be solved. And that's always an interesting way to look at things. And I like hearing from multiple sides.
And sort of along those lines, is there an episode that sticks out to you as one of your favorites? As somebody, like for our listeners, if somebody hasn't listened to the podcast before, is there one that you would suggest that they listen to?
I really like that rare earth piece. That took a long time and I was really happy with it. I really liked our India piece was really good. The Karabakh piece, the second Karabakh piece was the longest piece we've done, but I still really liked doing that one. That was really interesting for me. Private militaries is one that I was pushing for a long time. And when we did it, it was really, I really enjoyed it. So private militaries, rare earths, those are probably the two I'd tell people to start with, because they're not exactly country focused, but they're more wider implications. But obviously, the show is designed that you can follow the show each and every week, which is great, or you can just pick the topics you like. And I know there are people who religiously listen to the show if it's on a former Soviet Union country, but won't listen to, let's say, a piece on the Caribbean, and that's fine as well. Guyana was an interesting piece as well, because it was the first time that I had a president of a country call me a bastard. So that's I could tick that off the list, I guess.
That's exciting.
Achievement unlocked.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a nice bucket list item. I can't say that's happened to either of us yet. Who knows? Who knows what the future holds?
Yes, he was brazen enough to say that we were lying, that he didn't sign a contract with ExxonMobil, not realizing we had a photocopy of the contract with his signature on it. Yeah, the guy in his press had a fun day with that one.
So yeah, that's I'd recommend for everyone to check out the Rare Earths episode. We'll have that linked in the description below, so you guys can check that out. And now we'd actually like to ask you about some geopolitics questions, as a big geopolitics fan and someone that talks to experts all the time. In episode 1 of the Redline podcast back in 2019, you covered the U.S.'s war in Afghanistan. I think it was at the 19-year point at that point. And then again, about half a year later in episode 26. And you asked a very interesting question in that episode, which was after the Trump administration had revealed their peace deal with the Taliban. And you asked whether the U.S. risks a rout from Afghanistan similar to the one that they faced in Vietnam. So with that sort of background, what is your take on the current situation in Afghanistan and the Biden administration's, for now, current short-term extension of the conflict into September of this year? Do you worry about power vacuums leading to rise of violent non-state actors in the region? And do you expect Afghanistan will fall in a similarly swift fashion as South Vietnam fell after the U.S. Withdrew their troops?
I think, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for Biden, unfortunately. But I think what you'll see is two Afghanistans. You'll see an Afghanistan in Kabul, which will be, semi-stable and pretty much like Kabul is today. And then you might see, obviously with the difference of government, but then you'll see the outer areas, Helmand and the south, which will probably be effectively under Taliban control. And the Taliban will likely take the power reins in Afghanistan. The US, as much as they are pulling out, they're setting up bases in Central Asia and Pakistan. So you'll likely see Air Force operations still in, going all the time. So let's say if the Taliban look like they're going to take a major city, you'll find US airplanes roll in and start, absolutely pummeling them, which will obviously deter the Taliban from making large military pushes more than they already have. The other one will be that they will leave private contractors in, and they will likely leave a small contingent of training staff. Now, right now, there is only about 3,000 soldiers left in Afghanistan. But effectively replacing them with private military guys, as well as some training staff and Air Force cover, will likely it'll keep the situation somewhat contained. The other option is obviously with Air Command still operating in the region, they'll still be running bombing runs, even if they are just drone and they are covert, there'll still be US operations in Afghanistan, because they are terribly worried about a power vacuum. Because right now, of all the tribes and different groups in Afghanistan, they all have a unified enemy, which is the United States. The moment the United States leaves, there will be a power vacuum and a bit of a struggle, to which is all fine if it's 6 Afghan groups going at it. But once one of those groups go, well, we're not winning, maybe we turn to ISIS or one of these other bad actors for arms and support and money. And again, if you align yourself with one of these terrorist groups, you tend to get a lot more money than if you don't. A rich sheikh in the UAE or in Oman or in Saudi Arabia is much more likely to fund a radical Islamic group than they are to fund a radical Afghanistan group. Mm. So you worry that one of the groups will take down that option, and then obviously that becomes a hotbed because no money comes for free, and they will have to do things on behalf of whatever group gives them money. So the idea behind this is that the US officially pulls out, but they'll still have their finger in the pie and they'll likely still chuck quite a lot of money into the Ghani government. And whatever, even if it's the Taliban government, they'll give a lot of money to make sure that the moderates will try and take some power and that the country doesn't completely fall apart. Saying that, though, this will put hesitancy to ever get involved in Afghanistan again, and it will likely become, not a failed state, but getting toward that way. Yemen would be probably a good example of, not quite as bad as Yemen, but down that road of where it will become a problem. Effectively, we can guess what's going to happen by the fact that the Russians are moving extra battalions into Uzbekistan to make sure that border problems don't flow over. Same with the Chinese. The Chinese are starting to set up large border containment operations in the Tianjin Mountains, and as well as in Tajikistan, to worry about the problems escalating from there. So when you speak to Chinese and Russian officials who specialize in this area, they always use this term I love, and I use it in the piece, going, Afghanistan is this swirling pit of doom. And you want to make sure that the pit stays right where it is, because you don't want it getting out into, particularly for China, Western China. So you'll likely see it almost be contained, and it will become Pakistan's problem to mostly deal with. But the US will still run air operations, covert operations, and lots of money in there to make sure that the government doesn't completely collapse. Saying that, though, it's not looking good. But what was the other option? The other option is the US stays in there indefinitely, and they're losing more and more ground each year. Effectively, by the time the Trump administration was in talks with the Taliban, when I spoke with arms dealers who I met with in Uzbekistan, they were saying that the Taliban no longer bought ammunition because they were capturing so much US and coalition forces ammunition.
Wow.
Which is a terrifying point, that they're taking so much ground and so much ammunition stores. The war is definitely going against the US, and they either have to double down and do another troop surge, which historically has not worked, or leave and try and remove that external enemy from Afghanistan. This is the only thing that will hold these 6 groups in Afghanistan together, is the United States being the enemy. The hope is that possibly you can now play the tribes off against each other and maybe divide and conquer a little bit more. Will it work? It's hard to say. There's a lot of factors to go with Afghanistan, and I think Pakistan will be a huge factor, as well as India will be a huge factor in that decision.
Just a few follow-ups on that, because that was a really interesting answer. When you say the situation is similar to Yemen, is the Afghan government in as weak a position as the Yemen government is against the Houthis? I mean, they're also taking a lot of territory right now over in Yemen. And then when you mentioned 2 states, is that sort of 2 states within Afghanistan, or could you envision an actual fracturing of the state? And then just for my clarification, for others, like, what is the limitation of roles between official US troops and private military contractors in terms of what they can do?
So when I said, we'll start with the Yemen one, the government in Afghanistan and in Kabul currently is not particularly strong. They are supported by the US, but for instance, when Afghan forces go up against Taliban forces, there's quite a lot of defections and surrenders. So quite often it'll be a case of, if heavy fighting comes, they'll call in the US, and the US will come save them with helicopters and inserted troops. The question now is that effectively all the troops that are supporting the Ghani government will now be looking at their watches going, well, if the US aren't here and the Taliban are going to take over, will the Taliban prosecute the people who helped the Ghani government? But if I flip sides now, then I'm seen as a hero who jumps ship. And it may be a better option for them, particularly historically, as the Taliban has punished officials from areas they've captured. So there will be a huge amount of defections the moment the US leaves, which leaves the Ghani government in a very weak position. The states question is not, I don't think it'll fracture. They'll still be in Afghanistan, and it will still be the borders that it is today, but you'll find areas of control. So for instance, the Tajik areas in the north will likely be controlled by certain warlords. The southern areas will likely be controlled by Pashtun warlords, and the western guys will likely be controlled by different warlords. Much like Yemen, effectively, they even, look at the Houthi territory or the government territory, you see that they're all under one flag and one banner, but there are definitely areas of control by different warlords. And we likely might see that happen in Afghanistan as well. Again, this is probably not a terrible idea because that way they can administer themselves and they don't unite to take on Kabul. And the idea for the US government will be, if you can keep Kabul stable and afloat, maybe it seems, they get to send someone to the UN, and maybe it seems like Afghanistan might have their stuff together. It becomes on the same way that countries like Somalia are at the moment, where Mogadishu is fairly stable, and they brag about the fact they're now doing passport checks. But the rest of the government is not nearly as stable. You go out, you can go to Mogadishu, have a cup of coffee and have a good time, but when you go 40 Ks outside the city, the government has no authority. So that is where we might see Afghanistan head into territory-wise, where Kabul and a few larger cities like Herat will be under government control, but outside the cities, it will become, effectively whoever is the strongest and who has the guns. And that will be a fairly terrifying position for a lot of people to be in. As for the private military contractors, these are effectively ex-military guys, mostly, special forces guys who are paid very, very handsomely. And they'll be paid to do escort missions. They'll be paid to guard certain facilities, do checkpoint work, and effectively just be the blunt end of the stick. So quite often, let's say if you have to eliminate someone to make it a monetization friendly term, effectively, you would send in a private military contractor, because then it's not the US government that does that. The US government doesn't kill people randomly. They would claim anyway. But a private military contractor going in and doing that kind of has this level of separation between it.
They can keep clean hands, sort of.
You can keep your hand a little bit cleaner.
Yeah.
And again, it won't make a difference on the ground. I mean, Afghans are going to see rather than an American flag, it'll be a company flag on their arm. But it will effectively allow the Americans to continue a lot of their operations whilst officially pulling out of the war.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about making a difference on the ground, do you think that the Biden administration sort of offer to the Taliban where they'll offer sanctions relief if the Taliban continues to respect some of the human rights advances under the current government? Do you think that that'll be effective?
Yes and no. Effectively, the sanctions are an important part because sanctions are a fantastic tool because you can push and pull as you need. You can give more support or less support. And with the Taliban, they're going to need all the support they can get. So the Taliban will likely want to win hearts and minds in the very first few years. And that will be, if a Taliban man walks into a village and has lots of food and power generators and cell phones and all this kind of good stuff, the populace will be much more likely to side with them and be much happier. The US is probably the only guys who will be happy to supply all that for the Taliban then supply that. And this was actually the US strategy in 2001. Now, we were effectively paying certain warlords to be very popular and give stuff away in the area. It was when we stopped doing that, and effectively they went, well, why do I need to be nice to the US now if they're not paying me? It's sanctioned bribes is almost the way you would put it, but it effectively will allow, if you give let's say you have 8 warlords in an area and you go, well, this is the one I think is probably the most likely to be reasonable. You give them lots of food, rice, water, and gifts to give away. He will win the support of the locals. He'll be in charge, and that's a guy you can deal with. And that becomes a lot cheaper in the long run than going and fighting, because an M1 Abrams tank is 1.4 million, which is a lot of rice.
Mm-hmm. Or $2 trillion.
Or $2 trillion. It's a lot of food and support. So the idea is to pick favorites with it. And effectively, once the population gets used to these gifts, so let's say the village knows, hey, every Tuesday there'll be a truck rocking up with food and supplies from my fantastic warlord. The moment you say, well, we're pulling that support, that warlord within then, will either have to behave themselves to get it again, or they'll have to go, fight against you and get it from somewhere else. The idea with it is kind of sound. I think it probably a little bit too late. They probably should have just kept with this plan back in 2001. But obviously, hindsight's
It's a
wonderful.
different strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. It does like sanctions again, like North Korea effectively uses the same thing. Like the US gives food and support to the UN, and the UN gives food and support to North Korea, and the US can push and pull that as they want. So quite often when North Korea launches a couple of missile tests, the US will say, hey, look, we'll increase your food supply by 10% if you stop the tests. And North Korea agrees. They get their support through the UN, and they stop the tests. What it does, though, is it sets a bad precedent that now North Korea, whenever they need extra food and support, they simply just start doing tests. And you might see the Taliban take the same approach. And every time, that they haven't got enough money from the US or support from the US, they'll blow up an embassy. They'll, attack a marketplace. They'll do something and say, well, if we had 10% more money coming into me personally, this could probably stop. This option did work for the Russians in Chechnya. So I think the US are hoping the same thing might happen here.
And so we've mentioned quite a bit that, this deadline to withdraw troops from Afghanistan has gotten pushed back to September. On a platform that we interact with quite often, Metaculus, the community median forecast for the likelihood that actually happens is 50%. So basically a coin toss. What do you think about this sort of pushback deadline, extended deadline? Do you think that we'll actually be able to withdraw troops by then, or do you think there's going to be further extensions? What would your forecast be for that question about the September deadline?
I would imagine it's possible. I wouldn't be surprised. It would be, there won't be a big difference between September and October. Maybe October, and effectively, but the points won politically and the narrative politically that will come from either pulling out on September 11th or pulling out on October 9th, which was the anniversary of the invasion, will be quite good. Effectively, it's there's a nice line in the sand, and you can put a nice circle around it and go, we were here for 20 years and I got us out of it, which is what Biden will say. They're already setting up. So there's been a lot of talks between the US State Department and guys like Uzbekistan to house more US bases, as well as Tajikistan and as well as Kyrgyzstan. But Uzbekistan is the very likely one to take most of the US operations. Pakistan, you'll find that, there was just there's been a lot of high-end meetings between the governments in Islamabad and Washington. So you'll find a lot of drone operations will continue to operate out of Pakistan. So they're setting up for the air command to be ready to go. As for PMCs, we're watching more private military rock in. So a lot of the shares on some of the private military companies we're watching closely, because as soon as that contract gets announced, we know their share price will jump. So even if privately it's announced to their staff, you'll watch the share price jump because obviously, because a lot of people will be sort of buying extra stock knowing that it's going to be jumping up. Because I don't know if you guys know this, but private military contractors aren't completely ethical at all times. But we won't go into that. Surprise.
You can go listen to the Redline podcast about private military if you want to hear more about that.
So effectively, there are a lot of signs that it is likely that he will be able to pull out unless something dramatic happens. Now, the idea is that, by September, October, things begin to quiet down anyway. So Afghanistan, much like a lot of countries in the world, kind of has seasons of fighting, because in the summer it's able to fight, but in the winter it gets cold. People tend to retreat back home, and you'll find a lot of, during that area of time, September, October, a lot of farmers will return home to harvest crops and return home to, get stuff sorted. So you'll find there will be a lot of great footage of soldiers, returning back to their farms, which would have happened anyway. But it'll be good narrative. The story's right there. It'll be very politically popular. I can see it. If I were a betting man, I'd say I'd give it about a 70-30 chance it does happen in September and at latest October 9th, because that would be a really nice narrative structure to bring it back exactly on the 20-year mark. I don't think we'll see the running across the bridge that the Soviets had. It'll be a lot of, handover ceremonies where they'll give a sword to some Afghan National Guard guy. Yep. But yes, I can see it probably happening.
So if it's 70% by September, what is it by October?
No, I'd say 70%. So I'd say it's 50% by September, 20% by October, 30%, another 20% by the end of the year, and 10% that it never happens. If I were to put some numbers on it. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it would have to incredibly destabilize for it to happen, and the Taliban aren't that dumb. They know that they can see the end ball game right now. The Taliban will likely be actually telling their commanders to shut up and lay low, because if everything seems fine, the US can pull out quietly. And now everyone's watching the clock. And the very famous line from the Afghans is, "You have the soldiers, but we have the time." And just waiting it out and being quiet for the next couple of months will allow the Biden administration to leave, and the Afghans will be able to do what they want to do.
Well, Andrew, I think we got ourselves a easy next Metaculous Monday forecast with that
Right.
70.
Just did all our work for us. Thank you.
So now switching topics to another region which you have a lot of expertise in, which is Eastern Europe, and more specifically looking at the situation in the Donbass region, sort of largely thinking about, the increased fighting that has happened since the start of this year between Russian and Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region and pro-Russian separatists. But focusing sort of more specifically on the recent massive Russian troop buildup and then since troop withdrawal, what is your take on the situation in the region, and sort of what do you believe Putin's motives were for the massive buildup on the border earlier last month?
So Putin's motives are, quite a few fold. There's lots of different objectives here. So for one, the Biden administration, particularly Blinken, has been saying that they're going to be very, very focused on the Asia Pacific during Biden's term. So this is a Putin kind of like, hey, pay attention to me. I'm still here. I'm important still. Because obviously that's still a big thing. Putin wants to be on the front of everyone's mind, because if America is, pushing against Russia, it will prove to guys like Syria and some of these African nations that Russia is still a viable alternative to America. Russia does not want to be in obscurity, because then they lose their influence in a lot of these countries they're trying to make developments in. The idea, the timing is normal. So what Ukraine goes through is called Rasputitsa, which is effectively where the whole country turns to mud. So you find, what's really interesting. I watch a YouTube channel that's World War II week by week, and all the tank operations are just kicking off in Ukraine, at the moment as well, because it's that time of year. Because effectively in winter, the ground is hard enough that it freezes up that you can run tanks. In summer, it's hard enough you can run tanks, but in the middle, it kind of gets really muddy and disgusting. So you're stuck to the main roads, which makes operations really hard to do any flanking moves. So tank operations and large operations happen about this time of year as expected. As for Putin, there are a couple of extra bonus operations here. So one, he wants to make sure that Ukraine can never join NATO, because that would be devastating to Russia. Russia has effectively this mentality, and probably deserved, between Napoleon and Hitler, that they do not want to be invaded or surrounded. And the Russian heartland is very flat. It's why Hitler's tanks got quickly through it so quickly. Right now, the Russians would love to anchor themselves and only have to defend that bit between, effectively northern Poland and southern Belarus. But if Ukraine were to fall and NATO troops were to sit in Ukraine, they have to defend the entire border of Ukraine as well, which would stretch the Russian forces so incredibly thin. And frankly, no one wants to do that. Now, if you have a border dispute, you cannot join NATO, because effectively it would put the US, if Ukraine was to join NATO tomorrow, it puts the US in a difficult position to A, trigger Article 5, and then the US is at war with Russia, and no one wants that. That'll be horrifying. B, don't trigger Article 5 and prove to your Eastern partners that there is, because Article 5 in the NATO Charter says that if any country is attacked, all countries will respond. And if you don't trigger Article 5, you're proving to partners in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, maybe the US won't come to your aid. Maybe there is a bit of a gray zone in this issue, and you don't want to have to play your hand of cards on that either. So this is why Russia has breakaway states in, they have Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, they have Transnistria in Moldova, they have Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and they have Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea in Ukraine. And if Belarus was to pull away, you'd likely see a breakaway state all of a sudden open up there as well. So this is a very standard Russian operating procedure. Now, the other important factor to realize is Nord Stream 4. So right now, a lot of the Russian gas pipelines go from the Russian gas fields, and they go through Ukraine into Poland and the rest of the European market. But obviously, that is not ideal for Russia because Ukraine takes royalties, Europe takes royalties. It's just the way of the world. Russia is effectively putting this pipeline from St. Petersburg in the north right through the Baltic Sea into the North German coast, called Nord Stream 4. But it requires a lot more private investment than Russia probably has the capital to do. It will be, it will still be chaired by Rosneft and Bashneft and Gazprom, but it will require a lot more private investment. Now, to an investor, if you're looking at putting money into Ukrainian gas pipelines, you might be looking at it and going, well, long term, maybe there'll be a war. Why don't we invest in Nord Stream 4, where it's in the Baltic, no one's going to invade it. No one can blow the Baltic up. And that is a good incentive. And in Russia, we're running every pamphlet for private investment going, put your money in Nord Stream 4. Yeah, you've got a lovely picture there, which really helps. Now, the 14,000 troops that were inserted into the region were pretty normal operating exercises. So Russia runs exercises at all times of the year, effectively going and testing logistics on officers, testing how fast they can move stuff. They do games every year where they see how fast they can get to Vladivostok, which is in the Far East. So none of this is particularly unusual. And there are a few signs that we would be looking for if Russia was to be heading to war. So we talked about share price earlier, and that's an important one. If Russia was to be really going to war with Ukraine, we would see companies like Almazy, who's a very large Russian defense contractor. Their share price would be shooting up because they would be starting to ramp up production of ammunition, artillery shells, all that kind of stuff that they're really good at, and as well as repair costs for armored vehicles and tanks. That share price hasn't had a huge jump. So we know that the executives of that company aren't having huge orders above what was expected. So business as usual. Quite often Russia enters operations, even when we entered the Georgian operation, all leave passes were cancelled for mid to high level officers, particularly mid-level officers. None of that's happened yet. So that's a good sign. We haven't seen any requisition of civilian trains either, which is quite a common operation for Russian logistics. If they think they're going to enter into a larger war, they'll start taking carriages and they'll start taking train beds in preparation for moving a lot of troops and operational equipment around. None of that's happened as yet. So this is more likely going to be a political operation to show Biden and see where Biden's response will be, to see if Biden is taking Ukraine as seriously as he probably should. B, a look to the gas investors to say, go to Nord Stream 4, don't worry about Ukraine. C, it gives training and training for soldiers. I mean, frankly, you've got to train all your mid-level officers to move logistics around anyway. Why not do it in the Donbass? These are the main operations here. Nothing too out of the ordinary. There'll be some scattered fighting, but from talking with guys I've been to Ukraine a couple of times and talking with guys that operate in that area, when it's non-fighting season, the artillery it's such a minutia, it's such a routine, effectively, that troops can go up. It's 12:08. Okay, 4 Russian shells are about to fall. Cool, fantastic. Back to lunch. It just gets in a routine, and as well as the fact that the troops in there are putting pressure on Vladimir Zelensky, who currently is doing a lot of gas deals with Russia. Vladimir Zelensky is the president of Ukraine, and having a lot of state elections as well coming up. This is a great lever that Putin can go, hey, give me a better deal on what I want in Ukraine, or I'm going to put in we'll make another harsh operation and we'll push towards Mariupol. And Vladimir doesn't want that. No one wants that. So he's likely to play more ball with Putin than would be expected. And so it's a multifaceted operation.
And then just real quick on the Nord Stream aspect, what do you make of the German Green Party saying that if they were to get into power, they would consider canceling that project? Do you have a sense of how that would affect things in the region? I mean, obviously the elections in Germany haven't started yet, but I think there was a poll recently where that at least had the Green Party leading. So it's certainly a possibility that they could get into power and potentially cancel it.
The Green Party won't won't win. It would be an incredible shock for them to win. We're likely to see a more lean to the right than the left in the next German elections. So the Green Party can say a lot when they don't have the burden of actually having to do anything. As much as they may talk about cancelling it, frankly, the German market is like 80% to 86, something like that, percent reliant on Russian gas. If the pipeline doesn't go through, the Russians will stop the gas, and it'll be a long, cold winter for Germany. And they won't blame, the average German citizen won't blame Putin. They'll blame the government in Berlin. And everyone knows that. So Russia, it's very unlikely this pipeline is going to be cancelled. And even if it was, they would just divert it to Poland, and then Poland would sell the gas to Germany. It's not, not the end of the world. And I'm sure that even if the Green Party was to miraculously pull off an election win, that they would literally just put a slight extension on it, jumping in on just over the border into Poland, and then Poland sells it, and they go, we don't get our gas from Russia, we get it from Poland. Completely different. Germany needs gas. This is the quickest way to get gas to Germany. That's kind of where it's going to be at. But if the Green Party runs on this as a major platform policy, then the other parties, particularly even the SDP, the Christian Democrats, as well as AFD, will run on this will cost jobs and make your gas more expensive, which is probably true. Again, I've been advocating for years for Germany to get off the Russian defense or Russian gas dependency, but frankly, they need gas, and the only other option is to ship it in from the Gulf states, which would be way more expensive. And also,
and riskier,
Suez Canal, and riskier, it seems, as we just saw from the Suez. So this seems like a no-brainer for anyone in the German gas markets. It also doesn't help that Rosneft, their CEO, is currently an ex-German chancellor. So the relationships are definitely already there.
I hope all of our listeners are taking notes. I mean, what you're talking about with respect to, it's like some of the signals that you're looking at if Russia were actually intending to go to war with Ukraine. A lot of those signals are things that Clay and I missed when we were, forecasting this question. So it's really interesting to hear. Sort of going off what you were just saying, where do you see the situation with Russia and Ukraine going from here? Do you think the conflict will sort of go back in sort of the seasonal dynamic as you're describing, going back to a frozen conflict, or do you think it will continue to escalate? Clay and I had forecast that there's a 20% chance that the Ukrainian military will suffer 250 deaths or more in any given month before October, per the Metaculous question, as you can see up on the screen. Yeah, do you think that things will get worse from here? Or do you think Russia's sort of made their stand and Ukraine understands, and now they'll go back to somewhat dormancy?
It'll be an occasional flare-up. It'll be what we're seeing in Karabakh, apart from that last big push where Azerbaijan made the big moves. It'll be occasional flare-ups. There'll be deaths on both sides, and it'll escalate or de-escalate as Putin sees fit. The important bit is, why would Putin want to change the game? He's got everything he wants out of this conflict. He's got the breakaway republics, so Ukraine can never join NATO. He's got the pressure point that he wants for Vladimir Zelensky. He's got the access points for the gas pipelines from Russia. Why would he want to change any situation? He may, train some new guys by putting a slight operation and pushing out from a town, but with effectively most of the sort of where the border is now is full of Ukrainians who will make it much harder for the Russians to give in. And if the Russians make a big push, let's say push for the Donbass or push for the Dnieper River, it's just going to encourage other countries to get involved and make it much more expensive for Russia. And as much as Russia has all this army and nuclear weapons and they're very powerful, their GDP is the size of Australia's. And we're not a major power. We can shake our fist at Fiji all we want, but we're not a major power. The Russians are fairly, this is the best position they could possibly hope for. So why would they want to change the board? I don't see it going too far escalating. There'll be fighting and there'll be shells and there'll be deaths, unfortunately, but Russia's happy with how the board's set at the moment.
So then I'm guessing then our 20% likelihood, you would say, is probably too high.
No, I think that's that's why I nodded. The number is probably fine because they can
sparks
shoot a bunch
happen and
sparks happen. There'll be, particularly if Russia, domestically wants to win some favor, they might make a slight push, and they'll have some fighting, and there'll be some great footage of brave Russian soldiers taking on these Ukrainian devils. There may be some little bits of fighting here and there, as we saw with whenever Azerbaijan and Armenia clashed on their borders. It would be 3-4 days of semi-intense fighting, 200 people die, and everyone goes home. Again, it's expensive to run large-scale operations, and I don't think Russia has the money to really run those. Not for no reason. They're much more focused in other areas of the world, but there will be deaths, there will be shells, there will be fighting, but no one's going to be making objectives like Mariupol or Kharkiv.
And so then going on to our third sort of geopolitical topic and third and last of the episode, we wanted to talk about the Olympic boycott, or potential Olympic boycott that's being threatened for 2022. There's a question on Metaculus again asking whether most of the Five Eyes and the Quad would boycott the Olympics in 2022, the Winter Olympics. We had forecasted a 23% likelihood of a boycott by the U.S. plus allies. Do you think that the U.S. will actually boycott the Olympics in 2022, or do you think it's more of a tool that they're using to sort of get concessions from China with respect to human rights, etc.?
I think it's more of a tool. I think, the framework we look at this is the boycott of the Soviet Olympics in the 80s. But between the 80s and now, there is so much more money and advertising tied into the Olympic Games. There is Coca-Cola, Budweiser, all your big brands are now very tied into the Olympic Games. Right. And all these brands know that if the US was to pull out, that would be devastating to their markets. So for instance, no one at Coca-Cola prints their stuff well in advance. It's why there are gazillions of cups out there at the moment with, Tokyo 2020 written on the side of the cup, whether for McDonald's or anywhere. They would be very, very hesitant to pull out because it would cost them a lot of frustration from companies like Coca-Cola, which is very important in Georgia, and a few other swing states. So Pennsylvania, there'll be a bunch of jobs in there. And Coca-Cola is smart enough to put a lot of their plants in these swing states, knowing that if any hurt came to them, it would be hurting in the jobs in areas that the US desperately need. If the US did, I think I read your predictions. I think, yes, Australia would likely boycott as well. Australia is, the yapping dog to the US, and we usually follow you guys wherever you go. So, yeah, New Zealand. Yeah, I think the UK might not, particularly with the Conservative government in where it is at the moment. But I don't think we'll boycott the Olympics. I think there'll be a lot of threat of it. But there is so much money involved in these Olympic Games for advertisers, for TV rights, for spending, for all this kind of stuff. I don't think it'll happen, but I could be wrong. Again, it's far enough out that it could change. We don't know for instance, what the 2024 elections will do. And if, let's say, it's President Tom Cotton who is president of the United States, that's much more likely. Actually, I think he probably would boycott the Olympics. If it's President Sean Hannity, yep, he would either boycott the Olympics or make it a Fox exclusive. One of the two. So again, we're kind of at a point where if the cards were set on the table as they are today, no. But we don't know what cards are coming up. And particularly with how wild the US foreign policy is flipping between parties at the moment. It used to be kind of like Democrat, Republican, but now it's like Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. That it's very hard to predict any more than about 4 years ahead at the moment. Again, 2024 elections will probably be the decider on what happens here. But at this time, I'd imagine there's enough money and enough jobs in important states such as Georgia that they probably will go ahead with it.
Following up on that, first of all, actually, a friend of the show and a super forecaster, Regina Joseph, she told us one signal to be looking out for is the ad buying spots. I believe she said on NBC, because I think they do the Olympics in the U.S., to see if those are going down or changing, because that might be indicative of a greater chance of there being an Olympic boycott, which ties into what you were saying right there. I was just wondering a few things. So we talked about like a full-on boycott, but what about a diplomatic boycott where the athletes still go, but perhaps they compete either independently or there is just like no delegation with them? So all the politicians stay home and they're boycotting the Olympics, but for the good of the athletes, they still let them compete. Could that be more likely? And then you also you slid in there that you said Australia would likely follow the US into a boycott, but not New Zealand. And that's something that we had said in our forecast too. And as someone who's, very close geographically to New Zealand, why do you think that there's this sort of difference, seemingly largely when it comes to China policy between Australia and New Zealand?
So obviously the difference comes from the governments in those two countries. New Zealand's government is currently Labor, and they're much more friendly international relations wise. So Labor in New Zealand is much more let's work with partners and try and curb. So they have called out what's happening in the west of China. And again, I won't say the words so we can not get demonetized yet, but they've called it out, but they're not going to stamp their foot and declare war, because effectively New Zealand Defence Force is not ready for a war with China. They're also not going to draw the ire of China as heavily as Australia will. They don't send that many competitors. Now, if the US were to go with what Russia does, so Russia right now can't compete in the Olympics because of their doping scandals. So they send a delegation that is just Russian citizens who happen to be there at the time. But viewership in Russia has dramatically decreased for Olympics because of this. And the US will be looking at those stats and going, well, if we're expecting viewership to go from here to here for the difference between wearing a USA jersey or I happen to live in Milwaukee jersey, advertisers will also look at it and go, well, we're going to spend, if it's that, we're not going to spend nearly as much. And there are so many companies, particularly in the media, who will need the money. So, they will be encouraging lawmakers both for jobs in advertising and marketing, and as well as TV broadcasters going, we've got to keep this thing going. There's too much money tied into the Olympics these days. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't think it's a particularly good thing, but it is what it is. London, I can't see going for it, but again, it's so far out that it's hard to make, it gets a bit murky once you get past the sort of 3-year mark. With the current Tory government, they probably would allow it to go, and they just wave the flag and say, well, it's not about China. It's about us proving to the Chinese that we're still better than them. Of something of that variety, they go for it. America, maybe. But again, we watched how much the ratings dropped during the Moscow Olympics. The advertisers would not want to see that again.
No, they definitely wouldn't. What do you think the implications and ramifications of the boycott would be? Like, if, right, ignoring the probability of it happening, if a majority of the Five Eyes and the Quad were to boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, is that sort of indicating the start of a Cold War? Or would that in some way sort of actually reveal that we've already been in one? Could it be something else? And sort of what would the ramifications be?
Well, I'd argue we're almost in a Cold War as is. And I don't think the Moscow Olympics, the pullout didn't achieve anything. It didn't end the war in Afghanistan. It didn't end the Cold War. It was just the Soviets did really, really well in those Olympics. That was about the only ramification that came from it. It was frankly very toothless. It was a way of, the midterms were coming up at the time. It was a way of just proving they're tough on communism. Will China give up, the importance of the West of the country because, US people aren't coming over to lift weights above their head? No, they don't care that much about it. As much as the Olympics are an important event and they are, a fantastic event, there's no way that China is going to give up crucial defense parameters and crucial national interests to have a couple of Americans come over to compete in sport. Again, I think the Americans know this as well, that they've seen how ineffective the boycott was of the Moscow Games. A boycott of the Chinese Games will be political domestic theater, not international theater. It'll be designed to prove to, some of the states that we have a tough on China policy without actually having to be really tough on China that would hurt you economically. Because, if you were really going to be tough on China, you start putting economic sanctions and a few other things. But doing that would drastically hurt the US economy because no one else has the manufacturing capabilities that China does at the moment. So no, I don't think it would actually achieve anything. And that's kind of the point that, it's a lot of, there's a lot of cons for not that many pros. I mean, you prove domestically something, but that's about it.
So that was really fascinating. Actually, all of those answers were, I feel like I learned a ton, and I'd love to just, as you did, like as you said offline, just grab a beer and pick your brain about some more geopolitical issues, because that was really fascinating.
Would love to.
But just going into our last topic for the podcast, as you know, at Global Guessing, something that we do very often is make forecasts about different events. And we were wondering for you, do you make quantified forecasts as part of your past academic roles or even as part of the podcast? And what applications do you see for those sort of analytical methods in the geopolitical space? Do you feel like they're useful, or do you feel like it can be a bit of snake oil sometimes from what you've seen?
And also, real quick, part of what we do, Andrew, I mean, it is, in our title that we
it's a big part of what you do.
The full
It's like a part of what Redline is geopolitics. So yes, analytical work and prediction work is incredibly important, and it gives you hard data to play with. And that's the trouble with anything, geopolitics wise, is a lot of it's kind of soft science. It's a lot of, well, this country would probably react to this country, and this country would probably do this. But by putting it in terms of, if a boycott of the Olympics happens, Coke will lose this much, it will hurt jobs in Georgia by this much, actually gives a lot of lawmakers and a lot of decision makers much easier data to play with, because it takes opinion out of things and goes into the territory of this is what will happen. And I think what you guys are doing is incredible, because that's what it does. It takes it into quantifiable measures. And there are lots of, algorithms will be able to work this out in the future. But, there are a lot of, if Russia was to go into, effectively, when you go into defense, you go into writing defense papers, you effectively put, best case, good case, most likely case, bad case, worst case. And by laying out your percentages, you kind of are doing that. You're laying out, when you're briefing a minister on, should we nuke Nauru, it would be, here's what the likely outcome would be based on the percentages of what we've seen from previous trends. Here is best case, here is worst case. It's probably, we think it's going to be somewhere around here with about a 80% chance of success. This is what you guys are doing, and it's why it's fantastic. It's quantifiable, and as someone who likes data and numbers and hard lines in the sand, I'm a big fan.
And you can also track, as well. If you put down a number on it, then it's, I think the real strong is putting down that number. Because if you say, like, very likely, that most times if there's not a number, you could be like, well, I really meant by very likely was a 60% chance. So really, it's fine. Whereas if you have a number, you can't you can't wiggle out once you have something on the 0 to 100 scale. Which, speaking of the 0 to 100 scale, brings
really quickly, I have one more question.
Go ahead.
I mean, what you were just describing just now about looking at, like the previous cases and using that to inform, the way that you think about what might happen in the future. It seems very similar to a lot of the sort of more scientific techniques that we use of base rates and of, teaming and all these things that we've seen that can decrease prior scores, make more accurate forecasts. Have you come across any of like Philip Tetlock's work, or have you read Super Forecasting, or are you familiar with that sort of whole area of quantified forecasting at all, or is that just something that's come naturally to you and your partners as you've done your work in the defense sector?
No, super forecasting is a real thing. And it's effectively taking good, educated bets. Again, you can never be sure of anything, because again, it comes down to, we can predict all sorts of stuff, but a President Donald Trump comes along, or a President Sean Hannity comes along, all your things go out the window. It's the longer the more you guess out, the more difficult it gets. But you can usually predict fairly well using data on previous decisions made, previous objectives made, and previous actions done on what the likelihood of things will be to happen. So we know, for the same reason that most of us in the defense industry can pretty comfortably predict that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine. And as I went through the stuff with you, most of it was on precedents. I mean, we started looking at data from the invasions of Chechnya, the invasions of Georgia, and those kind of guys, and we're not seeing the same trends. And that's, you look for trends and patterns, and effectively that's what you guys are doing, and it's a scientific way of looking at it rather than I done thunk it. Is not doesn't really fly
Doesn't cut the bread,
in papers. So yeah, trends, economics, and logistics is probably the most important thing, because you can try and hide your wanting to go to war, but you can't hide a bunch of trains and ammunition moving around a country just as easily.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have as great of a transition as I was just on a roll on, but that's okay, because this now brings us to the last segment of our show, which is the rapid fire round. We have 4 questions, which you have to make a quantified forecast about. And one of these, well, actually two of the forecasts we've sort of touched on a little bit today, but you have a chance to sort of reformulate them and give a precise number. So the first question is, what is the likelihood that Russia annexes territory in Eastern Europe by 2026? And an additional territory, obviously.
I'd say it's about 30-70. Maybe 20-80. Actually moving the territory is moving the borders is a big no-nos these days. No one does it. It will, effectively elicit a response from the West. If Russia was to annex, let's say, Donbass and Luhansk, they don't get the advantage of keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And at the same time, they already have virtual control of those areas anyway. Why would you bother moving the border? The exception to the rule would be maybe Gagauzia or Transnistria, who actually have referendums that they would want to join Russia, because they are breakaway states of in Ukraine for Gagauzia and Transnistria for Moldova. But it would be, the moment you do that, it would elicit the West to have to respond in some way. And at the point where, particularly in Transnistria, all this stuff is done through the Russian foreign ministry, they get all their power, everything comes from Russia. What does Russia stand to gain from changing where the board is set at the moment? I know they do the salami tactics, but again, to move out of the Russian Federation would likely elicit a Western response, whether that be heavier sanctions or or a military response. Crimea was a different story because it's such a vital importance to Russia due to the fact that it houses the Black Sea ports, and warm water ports has been on Russia's to-do list since Peter the Great. They could not afford to lose Crimea, so that was about the only one I can see that is incredibly important to the Russian defense sphere. If we look at where their borders are, to push into Finland, no point. To push into the Baltics would definitely elicit a US response. To push into Belarus, they view that as domestic anyway. To push into Poland starts World War III. To push into Ukraine, they've already got what they want out of that. Pushing Moldova, it would be a pain in the ass logistically, and at the same time, they've already got what they want. Transnistria has all the power stations and has full control over Kishinev on a political level. They can push and pull as they need in Kishinev. With Georgia, they've got what they want out of Georgia. Georgia can't move can't join NATO. Azerbaijan is already a friend of Russia's. Armenia is already a friend of Russia's, and Central Asia is a whole other kettle of fish. But hell, if they want to move the border, a couple of feet in on Kazakhstan, it's just desert on the border anyway. No one's really going to lose their mind over it. They wouldn't want to annoy partners in Central Asia either. I mean, you could argue that the South Ossetians, which is effectively a breakaway state in Georgia, they move the border all the time. It's a very common operation for the farmers to pick up the barbed wire fence that is the border.
It happened with France and Belgium recently. I think a farmer accidentally did that.
Yeah, accidentally did that, but they actually do this properly.
Yeah.
There are farmers that joke that they lost entire paddocks overnight because the Russians moved the border. But no, I don't see what Russia would stand to gain from moving the official borders when they can already just have complete influence over areas.
And then just changing topics slightly, what do you think there's likelihood that we discover evidence of alien life by 2030? And this can be single cell organisms all the way to complex aliens. UFOs in of themselves is not evidence. There has to be evidence of someone inside the UFOs or controlling the UFOs. So, yeah.
2080, we're not putting as much into space technology as we probably should. We're not likely to find anything on the moon. We're not likely to find anything. We might find there's water on Mars, but we're not.
There can be evidence of past life.
Maybe a single. maybe some single cell organisms. You'd be more likely to find, let's say, some of the moons of Jupiter. You might find some single cell stuff out there, but we just aren't, we're not putting as much money into space to go to the likely areas that would have, life. Would be expensive and time consuming and would take years and years and years to get there. Like, the Voyager probes are just making it out of the solar system now, and they were launched in the Nixon administration. And Nixon famously, when NASA came to him and said, we have this shot at getting this, using this slinging around Venus and going past Mars and Jupiter and slinging around a couple of moons in Saturn for this exact mathematical trajectory to get to the edge of the solar system. And he went, well, if we miss it now, Nixon asked, when was the last time the planets lined up like this? And they went, well, George Washington was president the last time it did. There are very few opportunities where everything lines up where you can sling off, because effectively it's very hard to send data that way. So you effectively have to mathematically work out that at day 6,402, hour 7, minute 42, second 81 or second 21, launch 2 seconds of thruster, and goes, and that's it. Everything has to line up so perfectly to make it work to get to that area of the universe. It would be very unlikely that happens in the next 7 years, and that we would be putting that much money into it. We're much more focused on Mars and the moon at the moment. Mars, maybe you might find single cell life near the poles, but again, it's pretty hard to find evidence considering we're only drilling into small bits of the planet. I mean, it would be like picking a random spot in Canada and drilling there and going, can we find life on Earth? If you picked of the like the big areas of the world, Sahara Desert, the north of Canada, the steppe of Russia, it's a good chance you wouldn't find evidence of life on Earth if you were just digging in the one spot. So I'd err on the side of no. I'd say probably let's give it a 1585.
1585.
And then the last two, one we've already talked about, the Olympic boycott in 2022. If you just want to put a number to that, just as a reminder, we gave it a 23% chance of a boycott of most of the Five Eyes or the Quad. What do you think for that one?
So it would be at least 4 of
I get
4 of the 7.
So 4 of the Five Eyes. For the US to pull out itself, I'd give it a no. I don't. The Republicans might win. So let's be safe and let's give it a 25. Let's give it a 20% chance. For all of the Five Eyes to pull out, I'd give it a 5% chance. Even if the US pulls out, there's no guarantee that New Zealand or the UK will pull out as well.
Perfect. And then the last one is, this is a question that we also forecasted. It's about what are the odds that Saudi Arabia and Israel normalize diplomatic ties by 2025. We've seen some talks seeming like, they're teasing at it, but, obviously situation might have to change in Palestine. What do you think about that question?
Much more likely than you think it is, than most people will probably like to think it is. Effectively, the way the Middle East is shaping up is it's a 4-pole world. So there's a pole in Ankara. So Turkey is actually much more powerful now than they have been for a long time. There's a pole in Tehran. Obviously, the Iranians have huge influence in the Middle East. There's a pole in effectively Saudi Arabia, and there's a pole in Israel. Now, the Saudi and Israel poles both rely on the US. So they're actually far more beneficial for them to be working together, because both of them really don't like Tehran or Ankara, both for completely different reasons. The idea behind normalizing relations is the fact that they can do joint operations together, they can share and tell. And effectively, if you speak to anyone high up in the Saudi government or the Israeli government, they are already in coordination with each other. The fact that you can fly US bases between one and the other is an indication that, they're already kind of talking with each other and it's fine. This is mostly for domestic politics. What will happen is this is a huge thing for it to happen. So they'll make sure they give it to what they view, they want to make sure the timing's right. So Israel will want to do it when
Is he frozen for you as well, Andrew?
Yeah, the last question.
Oh no.
little snippy.
Hello?
Oh, you're back.
Hello. Yep, perfect.
Can you hear me now? Yep.
Yes.
So where'd you get up to? Yeah, where'd you get up to?
I think you're talking about Saudi Arabia and Israel flying between bases. Yeah,
Between U.S. bases, yeah.
exactly.
So Saudi Arabia and Israel obviously do have some coordination already. They can fly between bases. If you speak to upper members of the Saudi administration or upper members of the Israeli administration, they already do coordinate with each other. But both sides will want this momentous occasion to happen at the right time. So you will likely find that Israel will want to do it under a Republican president because it will likely help a Republican president gain another Republican presidency. And they do far better under Republican presidents. They get far more aid under Republicans than they do Democrats. The Saudis will want the same, as the Republicans give much more aid and support to the Saudis than the Democrats do. They will likely wait for a time when there will be a Republican in the White House to do it. But again, it's only in name as it is. Both sides work on anti-Iran operations. Both sides work on counter-intel operations against Turkey. Both sides effectively coordinate their militaries and intelligence. Both sides share stuff. Both sides work with the US. Both sides have US bases. Effectively, they have been working together. And when they have these Israeli breakthroughs with Morocco and Sudan and UAE, they've been working together for years. It's not a huge breakthrough. It's just it's a dressing show of, oh, look, we officially have a route where you don't have to fly through Qatar anymore to get to us. It's window dressing. Effectively, as much as the people may still have beef with each other, and as much as low level operations may still be against each other, the high end, so kings and prime ministers and presidents of these countries will still, they coordinate all the time. And frankly, it's a huge card to play to end this conflict. Why waste it? Save it for a moment you need it, which will be when a Republican's running for re-election, or when maybe the king is embattled in Saudi Arabia, so when they maybe lost the Yemen war, or Israeli politics is maybe an appeasement of the left in the Israeli Knesset. If I were to give it a number, I'd say before 2020, what was it? Before 2025?
2025, correct.
30, yeah, 30-70.
And do you think that they would, like, let's say Biden were to win another term, would they wait until 2028 to do normalization? Because you were sort of thinking about it a lot from the government and the military side of benefits, but thinking about sort of the private sector side of things and the tech and investment side of things, it would seem like waiting for all that period of time just to get the right moment might, after a while, sort of be too much, right? Like if Biden were to win re-election and the Republicans weren't to reclaim the White House by then. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, that's the thing. They can do everything but official normalization. So you'll find that already the companies in Saudi Arabia can operate in Israel, and banks can operate between themselves. Already there is more tech going between the two. Effectively, they can do everything except official recognition. And that's because they're waving that card. Effectively, things won't change very much. It's the same reason that I just got engaged to my fiance, and everyone's like, "Oh, what's changed?" I'm like, "The official card." Thank you. But what's changed? Nothing really, because effectively we've been living together for years. We've dated for many, many years. It's a change in title, but how the bills operate in the house and how we communicate and operate as a couple has not really changed.
It's a formality.
It's a formality. Business, banks, sector, intelligence, all those guys are still already operating between Jerusalem and Riyadh. So why play the card unless you really have to? You only get to play it once.
Great. Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, especially on such short notice. We really, really appreciate it. And also for being super generous with your time. We know you're an incredibly busy person. Are there any socials or things you want to plug, anything coming up with the Redline podcast that you want our viewers to know about so they can stay informed?
So you can find us on most of your social media, at the Redline Pod. That's for Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. You can find us on Discord as well. We're on Reddit. We're on Swell. We're on we've got our website, which is www.theredlinepodcast.com. And you can stay up to date with, what pieces we have coming up there, as well as get in contact with us here at the show. But always willing to chat, and really, really enjoyed this chat with you guys.
All right. And that was the 12th episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.